Welcome to Civics and Coffee. My name is Alicia, and I am a self-professed history nerd. Each week, I'm going to chat about a topic on U.S. history and give you both the highlights and occasionally break down some of the complexities in history and share stories you may not remember learning in high school, all in the time it takes to enjoy a cup of coffee. Hey everyone, welcome back. A few weeks ago, I had the chance to sit down with Dr. Anita Chan to discuss her latest book, Predatory Data. Dr. Chan is a feminist and decolonial scholar of science and technology studies and earned her PhD from the MIT doctoral program in history, anthropology, and science, technology, and society. We recorded our interview over Zoom, so I'm inserting my standard sound quality warning here. I hope you all enjoy the conversation. Hello, everyone. Joining me today is Dr. Anita Chan. She is an associate professor of information sciences and media at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and an author whose latest book, Predatory Data, traces the history of eugenicist data collection and how these practices continue to influence society today. Welcome, Dr. Chan.
Hi there.
All right, let's dive right in. How did you come to researching the history of predatory data?
Well, I am a science and technology studies scholar by training, and my specialization is on feminist and post-colonial and decolonial approaches to technology. And eugenics history has been really a sort of underappreciated, understudied area of the history of information sciences. And so it was sort of a natural for someone like me working already in global context, recognizing that the forms of discrimination and marginalization that marginalized populations face, not just in the US, but in global contexts, relates so deeply to a history of datification and wasn't just about a kind of current moment in sort of digital practice and an internet economy and an internet boom of the contemporary. I could see that with my past project, which was on the politics of information for development initiatives in the global south and particularly in Latin America, and the way that targeted indigenous and rural artisanal populations for betterment and improvement in particular, and studying the kind of stratifying impacts actually that those global development policies and practices were inculcating. You could already see a sort of longer history and longer standing logic around how datification negatively impacted minoritized populations and marginalized populations. That wasn't just about the kind of contemporary. And so this project really allowed me to delve into that.
And you talk about this term predatory data. So for those who might be unfamiliar with it, what is predatory data?
Well, I mean, many of us sort of experience it already in this sort of the most sort of common way to frame it, I think, is sort of contemporary users and practitioners of digital life in the internet economy is just a way we experience predatory datification on commercial platforms. So it's the sort of means by which we are continuously profiled, usually in ways that feel deeply, deeply unconsentful or hyper extractive. And in fact, what the book, of course, delves into is the way that minoritized populations are disproportionately negatively impacted by these sort of logics of datification, the kind of, again, continuous extraction of data for the profit of a few, and the way that especially those designers of commercial datification systems and social media platforms, whether it's Facebook or Twitter, or now, of course, OpenAI's AI-based technologies, that over and over again, we see how deeply these systems negatively harm and impact minoritized populations' lives. And when we say minoritized populations, we're not just talking about, ethnic and racial minorities in the US, and in global context, we're talking also about the way that gender populations, even women, young users, and essentially almost every population that's not just a sort of white male privileged engineer has been negatively impacted by these systems, and the way that these systems essentially profit and grow from that kind of economy of harm where the sort of negative impacts on the lives of minoritized populations are essentially just thought of as collateral damage, essentially worth it for the kind of profit and growth, again, of systems that are controlled primarily by white, westernized male elites, techno elites, and the way, of course, that these systems actually connect to a longer history of predatory datification. That's not just, again, about the contemporary, but really sort of stretches into logics of eugenics history and the way that eugenicists and eugenic researchers argued for the necessary profiling and datification, especially of the poor, in order to preserve and protect the interests of racialized elites.
And that's kind of a perfect segue into my next question, which is how does eugenics and the history of eugenics and eugenics research kind of tie into predatory data?
Oh, well, it's at the sort of very foundation. So in many ways, I wrote this book as a kind of love letter to my students, my undergraduate students, especially in information sciences, many who go on to have professional careers in data science and AI companies, and many of whom, especially right now, are feeling deeply, deeply ambivalent about it. And there really is a reason why they have misgivings about these systems. And it's because, of course, the data-driven systems that stratify human life and reify racial and class-based hierarchies really operate on this logic of continual assessment to evaluate populations in ways, as I was just mentioning, that punish minoritized populations disproportionately. And that really this is a history that's over a century year old, that dates back to eugenics practice, and that unfortunately students, especially in data science, just generally aren't taught. But exactly the methods and correlation, prediction, and statistical regression that my students and data science students in general are asked to learn in order to professionalize and in order to credentialize themselves for work in Silicon Valley and AI companies, AI industries, and data-driven industries, et cetera. All these sorts of methods and correlation and prediction were established by eugenic researchers, Sir Francis Galton mainly, but also methodological innovations by Charles Davenport, Henry Goddard, Madison Grant, among so many other prominent eugenicists of over a century ago. And it was essentially these eugenic researchers who seeded what I argue to be the world's first cross-continental movement to datify populations and to monitor unfitness, with their goal essentially being from the get-go to literally remake democratic societies, and especially what democratic societies in the West, into ones that embraced natural hierarchy so that essentially the survival and interest of white westernized techno elites could be prioritized. And like what I call in the book, contemporary techno eugenicists, 19th century eugenicists too profited enormously from this kind of research agenda and extension of these predatory methods, both politically and financially, essentially from their spreading of eugenic disinformation. And so the book is just a reminder of how far eugenics got with popularizing their movement, particularly in the US, and how essential data was to that movement and to essentially solidifying their gains in terms of new policy around immigration, new sterilization laws in the US that were passed in over 30 states, essentially to enable the legal sterilization for mentally, physically, and morally so-called unfit populations. And they were also able to get the world's first anti-immigrant laws and immigrant exclusion laws that were passed anywhere in the world, with the Chinese Exclusion Acts in the US of 1875 and 1883. All these laws essentially were created to prioritize the protection of so-called Nordic populations, and even allowed political dissenters who were argued to be contaminating mental unfitness into the US population, even allowed for political dissenters or people with political dissent as part of their history to be excluded at the borders. So, of course, now we're seeing very parallel kinds of movements happening now.
Yeah. And when you touched on this in your previous answer, just want to give you a chance to kind of expand on it if you want to, which is you talked about how eugenicists were very influential in trying to create a westernized world that protected, quote unquote, the Nordic populations. And what ways did they help kind of inform immigration policy in the United States? You talked about the Chinese Exclusion Act, but I know you covered several different examples in your book. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, they were quite active in the lobbying for anti-exclusion laws that were gradually gained across the decades. So it didn't happen all at once. It really happened as part of a kind of moving the bar gradually, year by year or decade by decade. And anti-immigration laws were one of the first sorts of organizing sort of political agendas for eugenicists in the US. We could see this already with the Immigration Restriction League that it was founded at Harvard University in the late 1800s. Again, eugenicists of the day, especially in the US, it was not a kind of fringe movement. It was very much a kind of vanguard who's who amongst a kind of cultured, political, literary and especially research elite, not unlike how data science is sort of thought of and practiced now, again, amongst a certain kind of knowledge and research elite and vanguard and thought to be a sort of, you're a practitioner and sort of in the know if you are training yourself or becoming literate in sort of good data science practice, you are someone who is sort of readied for the future. So too, you could see quite grounded parallels with what was going on and who was participating in eugenics culture. Again, a kind of who's who of a lettered elite, but especially ones who thought of themselves and sculpted themselves as a kind of information and knowledge elite of the day, grounded in really privileged institutions from Stanford University. The first founding president, David Starr Jordan of Stanford University, was a eugenicist, and so too were various heads and deans of Harvard University, presidents of Harvard, Oliver Wendell Holmes, a dean of Harvard Medical School, and Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., the famed Supreme Court judge who ruled the Buck in the 1927 Buck versus Bell case that maintained the legal status of forced sterilization in the US. Again, all very prominent sort of all very prominent US eugenicists who had ties back to prominent research institutions and were again part of a kind of lettered and knowledge elite. And from the get-go, sterilization became one of the sort of a later kind of rallying policy gain that started at the turn of the century in the early 1900s. But anti-immigration moves were actually was the first kind of organizing effort for eugenicists in the US. And again, the 1875 and 1883 Chinese Exclusion Acts are ones that I underscore as, again, gains from US eugenicists of the day. We oftentimes remember the Chinese Exclusion Acts as really something that labor had gained, as, sort of something that especially workers in the West, were interested in lobbying for out of concern and interest and protection of jobs for miners and laboring classes who were weary of competition from supposedly, lower cost Chinese workers who were coming in. But when you look at actually the history of immigration law and recognize, of course, that 1875's Page Act actually targeted Chinese women. The very first anti-immigration law and exclusion act that was passed anywhere in the world, and then, of course, passed here in the US, really targeted Chinese women, supposedly based on their status as prostitutes, and in an effort to really not so much, of course, protect laboring classes, as in other sex workers at the time, who would have been potential competition. But really, this was an effort to protect well-born American families. And the lobbying efforts and the medical literature of the day all reflect exactly the kinds of anxieties around Chinese women and Chinese prostitutes, especially as sort of contaminating the quote unquote good blood of well-born American, as in white, native-born families. There was really a kind of interest in protecting white domesticity and middle-class domesticity, and an anxiety around the kind of threat to this sort of contamination of bad blood, and therein unfit kind of moral habits around proclivities towards drink or drugs and opium, laziness, prostitution, etc., licentiousness, all of that were sort of very much part of the kind of notion of what the contaminating effects would be of the Chinese. And as we saw with the first anti-immigration exclusion laws, not against Chinese men, but against Chinese women, really that this was about a kind of protection of white middle class domesticity.
Yeah. And in what ways did the eugenics movement kind of help develop and influence research infrastructures?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Well, I should say in the US, they were quite prominent. So we can go back to, of course, Galton, who was himself a biostatistician, who eventually had his biometrics lab installed at the University College London, very much as a kind of, again, named research infrastructure. He had a journal as well, a eugenics-based journal. Biometrica that was also associated with his efforts. Research culture was very much at the foundation of eugenics, the eugenics movement. And it was really using their role as quote unquote objective men of science, not so much politicians or people supposedly with a kind of vested interest, but men of science who could use their sort of authority as objective practitioners, people with a kind of tap into the way the world empirically did work and who had their own kind of relationship to data. All of this was central to the work of eugenics. And from the get-go, men like Galton and fellow eugenicists were obsessed with data collection, with the notion that the data would, of course, as they were convinced, demonstrate the kind of empirically, the kind of proclivity of fitness to concentrate amongst the already elite and well-born. That is, that fit attributes, the kinds of attributes, desired attributes around mental, moral, and physical fitness concentrated more prominently, more highly amongst the rich and the wealthy, and again, the already established political or financial and cultural elite. And that so too, unwanted characteristics, licentiousness, proclivity to drugs or drink, laziness, criminality, all of those things, forms of unhealthiness, all concentrated disproportionately amongst the already poor and undesired populations. From Galton's point of view, all of this meant that rather than seeing the kind of mingling that we were starting to observe grow across the 19th century with urbanization, industrialization, 19th century independence movements and anti-colonization movements, all of this, started to create new patterns of global, but also mixed race and just diverse movements and opportunities for mingling and mixing in cities and in countries in ways that patrician elite populations had never seen before. And for people like Galton, that triggered an enormous amount of anxiety. From his point of view, all of this he was quite convinced, and fellow eugenicists all were quite convinced, and their efforts, their mission was really to convince the rest of the public too, that this kind of mingling would inevitably lead to the degeneration of national economies and national societies, a weakening of those societies, and a fall of Western civilization because of, again, the sort of contamination of the unfit upon the well-born. Galton, from the get-go, was someone who was obsessed with counting and datification. He was someone who was convinced that he could count the perfect number of stirs and the perfect amount of sugar to create the best cup of tea, and would do things too in a much more sort of eugenic vein and strain, to spending time in various neighborhoods across London to create what he called a beauty map of London. So he would hold an invisible counter that was created with a pin and a little sort of piece of paper that allowed him to create invisible, pin pricks as he held the counter in his pocket. As he stood on London various corners of various neighborhoods in London to essentially compare how many quote unquote attractive women he could identify by his own, of course, objective judgment. And of course, by his argument, what he was attempting to prove really was that there were more attractiveness concentrated in the better off neighborhoods and diluted, of course, in the poorer ones, right? So all of this was again the sort of bolster, the kinds of moves and obsession with data collection was all very much in a and a strain to eventually build out an argument for really a eugenic policy and to demonstrate the kind of empiricism of eugenic modes of essentially organizing and managing diverse societies.
And you talked about how the movement, the eugenics movement, was not, an outlier. It was front and center. It had significant influence both politically and kind of culturally. And one of those was kind of demonstrated by a story that you told about the 1939 World's Fair. So can you talk a little bit about how the Futurama exhibit at that World's Fair kind of demonstrated this continued interest in eugenics thinking?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, I think maybe I'll back up a little bit and also give a bit of a snapshot of another story. All of this is sort of to just demonstrate that eugenicists from the get-go were really interested. I think one of the things that made them different from many scientific and research cultures, even to the contemporary day, is that they were not only interested in speaking to fellow researchers and fellow science. It was clear from the get-go, they recognized that they could only get so far by enrolling fellow elites and fellow scientific researchers into their movement. And so from the get-go, they were really interested in one, reaching out to political elites into translating their vision, how the world really did work empirically into kind of policy to scale out this vision again of a eugenic utopia. And they were also very cognizant from the get-go that it wasn't just a kind of political elite that they needed to enroll, but really that communicating and swaying public minds and public opinion through things like data visualization, through the use of installations in fairs, and of course in sort of the kind of most prominent of fairs of the day, the World's Fair. These were installations, World's Fairs at the turn of the century that garnered millions and millions of global visitors and were really a showcase for being able to model what the future world offered, what was sort of best of in terms of international culture, particularly around engineering and technology and the arts, but especially also kind of making gestures to what that future world would look like. And so from the get-go, I mean, even at the early turn of the century, you saw eugenicists make installations at sort of regular fairs. Galton would set up his own sort of moving installation of a biometrics lab where he was so proud that he had devised and designed, again, all of these sorts of modes of datification and physical quantification on things of like strength of blow, acuity of vision. Of course, he was also taking measurements on, size of head and also, things, recording other kinds of physical attributes of visitors. And with the notion that, again, visitors to this sort of installed lab would be able to get a kind of imprint of their own sort of value of fitness, their a metric of fitness for themselves, really sort of trying to inculcate and teach publics to read what it meant to recognize themselves as part of a kind of fit population. And these were Galton would charge goers, people who were being measured in his mobile biometrics lab, 3 pence a piece to be able to participate in this kind of self-metrification. And so this wasn't just anybody, of course. It was really largely a kind of paying population and a population that would be willing and able to pay for that kind of datification. Later on, you would also see at Americans fairgoers other more interactive exhibits that started to really try and again were installed with really a kind of educational goal in mind. So, at American fairs, you would see these quite interactive exhibits that eugenicists and eugenic associations like the American Breeders Association would set up, essentially that would allow, again, a kind of interactive experience for users to kind of get to see and experience how the world was seen from eugenicists, but also underscoring messages like some lives are born to simply be a burden on others. And under exhibits that were titled under those kinds of placards, some lives were born to be a burden on others, you would see a series of lights, one that would sort of blink on a certain, every various intervals that was labeled, this is the time, this is how often someone with mental unfitness is born. And beside it, there would be another light that would blink, more slowly, that this is how frequently somebody with mental fitness is born, to essentially just demonstrate that at some point, because the mental unfitness light would blink more rapidly, that would essentially just demonstrate to the user of the exhibit, the visitor of the exhibit, that society would eventually be overtaken with this kind of wave of unfitness. And so too, by the time we get to the 1939 Futurama exhibit, this is an exhibit that was installed at the 1939 World's Fair, a World's Fair that at the time was really known as a kind of wildly successful World's Fair with tens of millions of visitors. And the smash hit of that fair, again, these were installations that were really erected by, the who's of US based industry. And in this case, the Futurama exhibit was set up by GM with its designer Norman Bell Geddes as a designer with really his own kinds of eugenic proclivities. He was one of the sort of founders of this movement called streamlining, and which brought essentially eugenic principles into design. And the argument here was that more perfected forms of designs, more beautiful and aesthetically pleasing forms of design, articulated when you got rid of excess and polluting elements in things like motor vehicles or trains or airplanes. And in this case, Bel Geddes had designed the whole Futurama, again, to sort of immerse viewers as this sort of immersive ride exhibit where visitors essentially could experience the sort of ease and modern beauty and elegance, essentially the kind of frictionless elegance of what a world designed by streamlining principles would look like. And essentially when they entered the ride, they would be treated to this kind of God's eye view, sort of they would ride over a miniature created world that stretched in a ride that stretched over a mile long. So they would sort of fly over miniature cities that had been designed according to streamlining principles, with self-driving cars that again had no traffic, bucolic parks, and sort of societies that were filled quite conspicuously with non-diverse populations. Families that were playing beneath and enjoying the sort of benefits of a kind of streamlined society, but without the kinds of diversity and forms of pluralism and heterogeneity that one would experience in any modern day city. But all of that was sort of excised from this sort of perfect world of the eugenic streamlined utopia that Bel Geddes imagined. The kinds of principles of, and I should say that this ride was really a kind of, and it's sort of experience of streamlining, of a streamlined future and a kind of streamlined eugenic utopia was really the kind of smash hit, was remembered as really the smash hit of the 1939 World's Fair, with over 44 million visitors that had attended. Other practitioners too of streamlining principles would come to really underscore the benefits of streamlining's kind of getting rid of excess and taking away smelly, polluting elements in design. They would later go on to sort of make arguments about how this wasn't only about beautification and aestheticization, but also about creating more efficient modes of production and essentially making sure that one's sorts of products and world of producing model of producing goods enabled the most economic efficiency possible and enabled also smarter forms of dynamic, flexible, responsive designers. So you really saw essentially a kind of shift in this sort of late 1939 period, or late 1930s to the early 1940s period, as growing concern was coming amongst American eugenicists that the unpopularity, that awareness of the war in Europe, of World War II, a growing kind of unease. American populations still had not really woken up to the horrors of World War II yet, but some were getting more and more information already by this time, by 1939. And there was really some unease about what this would do to the kinds of prominence of eugenics. Again, if their growth and popularity was about gradually moving the needle, right? Essentially being able to get eugenic anti-immigration laws passed against the Chinese first in the late 1800s. Then by the 1910s, right, several decades later, expanding anti-immigration laws so that they would include Southern Europeans and Eastern Europeans and largely Jewish populations with the 1917 and 1924 anti-immigration acts, right? So those are prominent new gains. Also expanding anti-sterilization laws that began in the early 1900s. And again, by the mid 1920s, had made gains in over 30 states, right? Passed in over 30 states. These were gradual movements, but were efforts to essentially continuously move the needle in public opinion into expanding their acceptance of who should be denied rights, what populations were proving to be a threat to well-born, especially white middle-class Americans, and therefore who needed to have their rights overturned, excised, truncated, or even altogether deported from the United States in order to again protect the well-born. This didn't happen overnight. Again, they were gradual gains over and over again, testing public opinion and moving that needle further and further to the right.
Yeah, you cover so many different facets and factors and ways that eugenicists really kind of contributed to the moment. And I am curious, how does understanding this history of predatory data help us kind of understand where we are today?
Well, there's certainly no illusion that we're seeing, of course, various cheerleaders of extreme right-wingism in the US and MAGAites right now working in literal alliance with Silicon Valley today. I mean, it was really part of Donald Trump's whole reelection campaign, quite central to it all. With Elon Musk playing a very prominent cheerleading role and also a very explicit financial backing role, not just him, but of course, figures like Peter Thiel and figures therein who, of course, were already donating and have continued to make donations to support MAGAism and the Trump agenda. And we're watching a new wave of really popularizing eugenics, I argue, what I call contemporary techno eugenics really reemerge through this kind of alliance. And we notice it in everything from Donald Trump's contemporary compliments, when we hear him say things like, I see this audience has a lot of good genes, right? When he's making his pleas or he's making his overtures and greeting audiences at rallies, to his arguments that we need to have more geniuses in government, or saying that if we had more geniuses in traffic and transit control, we wouldn't have accidents, the kinds of aviation accidents that we saw happen earlier in the year. We now, of course, hear Elon Musk making quite ample and obvious amplification of great replacement conspiracy theories. These are, of course, conspiracy theories that were first promoted by eugenicists from over a century ago. His warnings are that Silicon Valley must have more babies in order to save civilization. And of course, he's not saying that everyone needs to be having more babies. He's saying explicitly that Silicon Valleyites need to be having more babies. And we need to start to see the pronatal movement amongst a kind of white knowledge elite. And then, of course, we hear Peter Thiel's own warnings that are now, really over a decade old, that there is a war between democracy and technology going on. Mark Andreessen is another figure that I track in the book, a prominent venture capitalist in Silicon Valley, whose seedings and whose mentorship role, along with Peter Thiel's, has helped to support any number of different companies across Silicon Valley, from Facebook to PayPal, etc. Mark Andreessen's own musings that unless we defend AI against its socialist enemies. And this is literally taken out from recent writings of his, from his Accelerationist Manifesto from October of 2023, that we must defend AI against its socialist enemies, quote unquote, and deranged, quote unquote, government regulations that will see to a stagnated future for the West unless we fight against these things. I mean, again, you're sort of just seeing, again, contemporary techno elites really sort of stretching into and reaching into a eugenic playbook to try and, again, reseed and test the waters for trying to popularize eugenic thinking amongst a mass audience. That's really, one of their primary objectives. It's not, obviously, this is not just a kind of question of trying to garner more wealth for themselves. They could certainly be doing that without making these sorts of very public overtures and trying to sort of, again, oversee policy and have a direct hand in the making of policy, and again, sort of grandstanding and taking credit for it, but then also using those opportunities of highlighting their protagonism really, again, as modes and movements to save civilization. That kind of language and these sorts of overtures and messaging are not just are not trying to serve their own sorts of boards, and aren't really only about gaining capital. This is really about a kind of larger public messaging where they're using their own status and authority supposedly as men of science, and men who by default supposedly should be thought of as having gotten something right, and are using and are privileged, the thinking goes, right, with some kind of exceptional intelligence or secret genius that got them to their kind of status of the world's wealthiest men. So all of those sorts of things sort of collapse together. No one mentions, of course, that that Elon Musk's own wealth is built upon generations of essentially disappropriation from South African populations and Black South Africans who were dispossessed, as his father was an emerald miner in South Africa. His own narrative, he tries to emphasize his own narrative as someone who, of course, pulled himself up by his bootstraps and was able to sort of make his wealth from within a competitive tech industry, without, again, underscoring all the sorts of forms of privilege and exception that would allow him to get to the place where he is now. In any case, they over and over again underline and underscore their own supposed status as men of secret genius, as men of science, in order to attempt to speak for other places and allow their decision making to expand beyond just the oversight of their own companies.
And you end the book with some recommendations for how to move forward. So, can you speak on a few of the tactics you outlined?
Oh, yes. I mean, I would say from the get-go, I try to underscore also, that there's also a long history when I talk about a kind of invisibilization of history and a kind of cognizance of the long history of predatory datification that's existed. Resistance movements that have existed really too for over a century against predatory datification have also existed, and those too have been really quite invisibilized. And so one of the first things I underscore is to really just embrace a version of knowledge pluralism and data pluralism. And let's not assume that either computer science or AI is now sort of has got the purview of the world and is the sort of best means to sort of capture some version of universal knowledge. Know your history and recognize the value, again, of different forms of disciplinary pluralism and knowledge pluralisms that exist. The absence of recognizing the history of things like the book, what I delve into the book are the long history over a century old of feminist and immigrant-based anti-eugenics datification movements. So what I argue for is feminist data movements from the turn of the century, using the example of the Hull House settlement house, based close to where I am at the University of Illinois, based in Chicago, that was based in the 19th ward, that at the turn of the century was very much a kind of prolific space for immigrant residents, but also for immigrant-based sweatshops. And Hull House was one of several hundred settlement houses in the U.S. that had popped up to essentially address problems of urban alienation and poverty, but is really recognized by historians as probably the most prominent US settlement house amongst the hundreds that had emerged of the day. It was founded by two feminists, Ellen Gates Starr and Jane Addams, who were also partners at the time. And they really formed Hull House to be a sort of alternative research space for especially people who were alienated from a male dominated white native born academy. So most of the researchers who came into and residents who came into Hull House were predominantly women, many who were exceptionally well poised to become leaders of any number of different kinds of civil rights, justice based, and progressive reform movements in later decades, but who came to the Hull House really, again, looking for an alternative knowledge culture and research culture that they were not finding in the male dominated academy. So immigrants too would find different kinds of roles there. And when you look at publications like the 1895 Hull House Maps and Papers volume, which I delve into in the book, you can really see the kinds of collaborative efforts of women authors, of immigrant researchers really coming together in chapters that pushed back, and chapters that exemplified research, again, that was done by immigrant and women authors, and that tried to represent, that worked to datify their community, but in ways that is the 19th Ward neighborhoods and their neighbors and the immigrants who were living around them. To try and understand the economy of sweatshops and the working poor. But unlike eugenic models of the day that really blamed essentially the poor for their poverty, right? That this was, if you were poor or economically alienated, it was your own fault. It was because you had made bad decisions. Or, of course, this is all sort of hereditarily determined, and you were only expressing your own proclivities towards laziness, criminality, etc. Again, which were all, sort of individually then faults for your own poverty, and the Hull House Maps and Papers and Hull House authors and researchers instead understood that this one wasn't about individual failing. Poverty was really structural. This was about a system that worked to exploit the working poor, and they documented this in wages that were being driven down, in the kind of exploitation of families and households, so that even children as young as 2 and 3 were being drawn into work in factories. They tracked the kinds of correlations between childhood deformities, physical deformities, and work in sweatshops, in adult ailments and poisoning and toxicity levels, and work again in workplaces and in factories that were exposing workers to toxicity levels. And they really, because of the kinds of forms of alternative datification that Hull House had been up to in those decades, they helped to pass any number of different sorts of prominent legislative reforms of the progressive era, from the 8-hour workday to anti-child labor laws that were at toxicity and safety level regulations for workplaces. They were first modeled in Illinois and then became national law. All of this, again, is sort of a recognition that it wasn't just that eugenics forms of datification, had taken over all spaces of research culture and thinking, and that there were indeed quite obvious pushbacks of the day, and even quite successful ones. We just don't teach our students in data science and our students in broader information sciences, this kind of history. And what kind of data science practice would we have if we recognize not just sort of like the deeply embedded eugenic forms of thinking, but also the kinds of long efforts to intentionally push back against them? If we were more mindful of exactly that and trying to pass on these kinds of traditions, that if we were going to break against this sort of a eugenic bias in the way that we quantify and datify populations that enable us to stratify them and measure them on some kind of hierarchy of value, so that some lives become adjudicated as better worthy of protection and some just aren't, which is essentially the kind of decision that so many tech companies have normalized today, in simply deciding that the safety and security, right, keeping minoritized populations safe on online platforms, trying to monitor speech to try and keep hate speech from really emerging, or disinformation campaigns that end up being expressive of different kinds of hate speech. Protecting those populations is essentially too expensive, that it's just not worth it for the owners of these tech platforms. And if we had a different kind of teaching of data science to more intentionally recognize that you have to work against these kinds of biases in forms of quantification that enable this sort of ease and normalization of trying to evaluate and try and calculate an ultimate value for different populations and lives, recognizing the impact that information platforms and social media platforms will have on them, would we have a different kind of information economy? And so I argue and would argue to our audience today that really leaning into and demanding a different kind of data science practice and education, recognizing how deeply humanities and just a kind of disciplinary pluralism needs to be architected into those programs, that we can't continue to design AI classes or data science classes as if we're trying to please US tech companies and Silicon Valley. I have no idea why we are continuing to do this, especially in a moment where the sheep's wool is off. Like, it's very obvious what kind of thinking is missing from even your most generous kind of portrait of what Silicon Valley leadership looks like. It's very obvious what forms of conversations is just missing from their mental map of what matters and what kinds of thinking and conversations should be foremost in their imaginaries. We need to be making sure that our future data scientists do not continue to have those sorts of blinders on, and make sure that we're much more accountable to the kinds of conversations that everyday publics want to be having around AI and technology. And when you look over and over again at the kinds of surveys that organizations like the Pew Research Institute and Center has been conducting around AI and public opinion in the US, you can see over and over again just how far complete polar opposites what the thinking is around AI amongst normal Americans versus where the conversation is for people who are considered to be AI experts or closer to the data science economy. And they are just worlds apart. Whereas one side of the population is almost like 70 to 80% either doesn't know what to think or sways negative, that they are not convinced that there will be more jobs and that their lives will be more secure with AI, versus the other side that looks like, well, we could live with it. We're still not sure, but it sways much more positive. That's a dangerous, I will say it's quite interesting because you won't see all white collar workers actually say that they feel on the whole positive. It just looks more positive. And yet even still, we're still designing our AI courses as if we're trying to please Silicon Valley. It just doesn't make any sense. We should be holding ourselves as knowledge institutions and as higher education institutions to a much better standard and be more responsible about stewarding the kind of conversation that average American households want to be having. And I think if we did, we would likely be seeing very different kinds of outcomes. I think part of the reason why you see such distrust of higher education institutions right now is in part because in terms of the kinds of ways that we've executed, knowledge practice across US campuses, it only makes research elite look precisely like that. Yeah. Elites who are disconnected, especially on questions around technology and science, from the relevant concerns of average American households.
And as we wrap up, where should people go to learn more about you and your scholarship?
Oh, thank you. You can find more about me on my website, anitachan.org. The book is available at the University of California Press. I love that the press also made the book available as open access, so you can download a free copy, whether you're here in the US or elsewhere around the world, and any place where you can essentially get an electronic PDF. And yes, I'm also, accessible through the University of Illinois. So thank you so much Alicia, for asking that question.
Of course, of course. And so to the listeners out there, I highly recommend picking up a copy of Predatory Data, which, as Dr. Chan just mentioned, is available as an open access book, which means it is free to you. And if you ever wanted to know more about eugenics or how data collection practices have been used to influence past and present policies, this is definitely a book for you. Thank you again, Dr. Chan.
Thanks so much, Alicia, and to your listeners.
And there you have it, folks. My sincere thanks again to Dr. Chan for spending her time with me. If you are interested in her book, it is available for free thanks to the University of California Press. Of course, you can also buy a copy of the book wherever fine books are sold. Thanks, peeps. I'll see you next week. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of Civics and Coffee. If you want to hear more small snippets from American history, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.